Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar. My name is Amy Blythe and I am with Tri-Hydro Corporation. I'd like to welcome you to our presentation, EPA's Proposed Oil and Natural Gas Methane Rules, What You Need to Know. Our speakers today are Jennifer Beaver, Director, William Weiss, People and Ferguson, Dan Wood, Air Compliance Specialist, Tri-Hydro Corporation, Jay Christopher, Senior Scientist Specialist from Tri-Hydro Corporation. With that, before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. All attendees are in listen-only mode. If you have a question, please make sure you submit it in our questions panel and we will address it at the end of the webinar. There will be a Q&A after our speakers have presented. If we're unable to address any questions in our hour and a half together, we'll answer them via email after the webinar. Also, in your GoToWebinar attendee panel, we have included a copy of today's presentation in the Handouts tab. Finally, you will have the opportunity to complete a very short survey when you exit the webinar. It will take just a minute and your responses help us create valuable webinar experiences for you in the future. Please place your topics you'd like to hear about for future webinar in the questions panel. Now, I'd like to introduce Alan Olsen, Executive Director of the Montana Petroleum Association, to say a few words. Alan?
Amy, like I said, I can't thank you and the staff at Tri-Hydro for giving this opportunity to get a little more information on what's coming down from the federal level in regards to methane emissions. We've got a really excellent panel of experts here to kind of bring us up to speed to what's going on. And I would definitely encourage anybody that's got any questions to please type them into the comment section, and I'm really hoping for some good discussion here. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you, Alan. Appreciate the opportunity. Okay, let's get started. Jay Christopher, our moderator and speaker today. I'm going to introduce Jay. He has over 40 years of industry environmental experience. Since 1990, Mr. Christopher has primarily focused on air quality issues in the petroleum sector with results-oriented hands-on experience in the environmental consulting industry, as well as in industry corporate headquarters and facility regulatory settings. He managed the environmental compliance program and environmental professional staff for a major refinery's downstream business. Jay has been directly involved with negotiating a federal state consent decree affecting 4 refineries and overseeing implementation of 2 different consent decree programs. He has also been a primary negotiator regarding several state compliance actions, interacting directly with state and federal regulatory and legal staff with a track record of achieving practical, achievable solutions. With that, go ahead and take it over, Jay.
Okay, thank you, Amy. So we'll hit the next slide. And today we plan to provide you all with about an hour and a half, including some time for questions, as we talked about the Environmental Protection Agency's proposed methane rules. We'll cover a little bit about how have we gotten to where we are right now. EPA's proposed new source performance standard, that's what's being referred to as Quad B. EPA's proposed existing source standard, also referred to as Quad C. EPA's proposed Appendix K, which is the OGI monitoring protocol that EPA has developed, and then some things that you should be thinking about to get ready right now. So let's keep going. Okay. First, we're going to talk, I wanted to talk myself a little bit about some of the rules and how we got to where we are right now. The original rules that came out really focused on natural gas plants and glycol dehydrators. Those are the first rules, and a lot of people in the gas plant industry will still refer to the new source performance standard referred to as subpart KKK, which is an LDAR regulation, leak detection and repair program. And that affected natural gas plants that were constructed or modified or reconstructed after January 20th, 1984, and went all the way to August 23rd, 2011. It's typically thought of as a Method 21 type rule, where people are going out and doing the sniffing with monitors and things like that instead of cameras. That final rule actually was published in June of 1985, and there have been several amendments to KKK over the years that have modified and tweaked some of the language. Another one that a lot of people don't track, but I wanted to mention here just for completeness, is a National Emission Standard for Hazardous Air Pollutants, a NESHAP rule. Sometimes most people refer to it as a MACT rule, and it's called Subpart HH, and it focuses on benzene from glycol dehydrators at the production site. There's also a similar rule, Triple H, which refers to more downstream type applications in the transmission sector. But that rule has also been published and modified several times over the years as well. Next slide, please. Then came what I refer to as the production-oriented regulations. They're the ones that most people are thinking about, especially on the upstream oil and gas production sector. First, there was Quad O. That's a new source performance standard, and it applied to facilities that were modified, constructed, reconstructed after August of 2011 and before September 18th, 2015. That rule first came out in August of 2012, and it was amended several times over the years, and which keeps it a little challenge to keep up with all those details. Then came the infamous Quad OA. That's what most people are thinking about and dealing with right now in the upstream side of the world. Quad OA was finalized in June of 2016. It applies to facilities that were constructed, modified, or reconstructed after September 18th, 2015. And again, there have been several modifications since that period in time. Next slide. Now things get really complicated, and this one I wanted to show mainly on Quad OA. Since Quad OA came out, and a lot of you remember and have lived through these changes, there were a number of different steps and activities and rescissions and things like that that happened over time. This bar chart, and it's not totally lined up from a linear standpoint in terms of the spacing, but it gives you an idea of all the different steps that have happened, including some stays that occurred in Quad OA, and then under Quad OA also some rules that were finalized in September of 2020, one of which was rescinded through the actions of the Congressional Review Act, which happened in the current Congress and administration. And that one pulled back what a lot of people generally refer to as the policy rule, which really addressed more whether methane was a regulated pollutant, the inclusion of the transmission sector, but also created a pathway directly for including establishing the existing source guidelines through the Clean Air Act under Section 111. So with this, I'm going to go ahead and transfer over after this slide to Jennifer Beaver. But I thought I'd give a little background for Jennifer before she starts. Jennifer is a director at Williams, Weiss, Pebble, and Ferguson. She's a licensed attorney in Colorado, North Dakota, and New Mexico. She's a director at Williams, Weiss and assists companies with respect to all aspects of state and federal air quality and climate change regulatory regimes, including rule and guidance development, permitting, implementation of guidance programs, self-evaluation of compliance, and enforcement. Jennifer is one of the leading legal experts on the methane emissions from the oil and gas sector, having led industry's efforts in Colorado's numerous methane rulemakings, and having represented several companies in enforcement at the state and federal agencies with respect to emissions from oil and gas storage tank facilities. Jennifer has represented a range of companies in the energy and natural resource space, from the oil and gas operators, pipeline companies, ski areas, mining companies, and industry trade associations. Jennifer will be sharing EPA's proposed NSPS Quad O-B and Quad O-C proposals. And Jennifer, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you so much, Jay. I'm really happy to be here with all of you today. I think Jay did a great job of explaining the quagmire that is Quad O, as I like to say, what. You know, one of the things that I thought about doing, but then I figured it would make you try and guess my age is, you know, was to do a poll on what Quad O letter will they be on when I decide to retire. That's kind of my internal ongoing bet that I keep placing with myself. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk to you about Quad O, B, and C, and kind of what they are and what we know and what we don't know. And unfortunately, frankly, in this circumstance, there's actually a lot we don't know, and we're waiting for some more information. I think Jay did a great job of explaining to you kind of the history on Quad O and Quad OA, and many of you are going to know some of the basics of this with respect to Quad O, B, and C. But Quad O-B, as Jay alluded to, is the new and modified, new source performance standard. So it's for new and modified sources. And currently they are essentially saying the effective date for that was November 15th, 2021. And I'll get into some of the issues and the concerns about that timing in a minute. And then Quad O-C is going to be for existing sources. And what's interesting is it's technically arguably not a rule in the same way we think of Quad O-B as being a rule. It's guidelines that ultimately EPA will publish that they will then require the states individually to look at those guidelines and develop their own program. And it's got to be essentially equivalent to the program that's the guidelines that are proposed by EPA. And so states will ultimately take on the role of adopting actual existing source rules pursuant to Quad O-C. But what EPA is doing will really set the stage and the standard for what the states are going to have to do. So before we get into sort of the nuts and bolts of like the equipment that's impacted and some of the changes that are pretty dramatic from the last round, I just want to raise a couple of outstanding questions. When the proposal came out in November, there was no rule language accompanying it. So in many cases, that's made it pretty difficult to figure out exactly what they're intending. And we have Quad O and Quad OA to look back to for many of the concepts and some of the rule language, but we really don't know. And so the lack of rule language has done, I think, a few things. One, it has made it difficult to comment on and difficult to really understand the implications. And that's particularly important because they're saying that you became a new modified or if you were a new modified or reconstructed source after November 15th, then you would be subject to it. But the real question is subject to what? You wouldn't even know currently how to design a facility that was new to comply with the rules because you don't have any rule language. That is going to be an issue that I think is going to play out from a legal perspective as this goes forward. I know that it's been raised to EPA in numerous comments that it's not believed they have the authority to make the effective date in November if they have not submitted the rule language. But to date, to my knowledge, EPA has not really been willing to make that modification or say that they're going to change things. I could see them making some of the interpretations on even a source by source basis, depending on how this goes. And additionally, what they made very clear in their November 15th rule language or proposal, not rule language, is that they are going to be submitting a supplemental. And that supplemental will contain the rule language for kind of all the concepts and the detailed pieces they laid out in the November 15th proposal, but it will also flesh out areas, which we'll talk a little bit about, like pigging and truck loadout, that they really didn't describe in any detail at all, but that they asked for comment and information on. And so the supplemental, which I understand is likely to come later this summer, is going to have not only the rule language for what we've seen to date, but likely new rule language if they decide to proceed with any of those other source areas. And then the question that we get a lot is timing on the emissions guidelines, and it's really not entirely clear. Currently, EPA has allocated no cost for the existing source rule until 2026. And so it seems to be that they believe that this rule, if it came out in 2023, that states would likely have, a couple years to get the emission guidelines adopted into rule and then become effective. There's been some litigation on kind of the timing of when emission guidelines become implemented. And so, but EPA has not been 100% clear on what it thinks the timeline is for here, other than the fact that it hasn't allocated cost until a few years out, which suggests that it won't be immediate. And then they also do specifically in numerous places kind of anticipate a phase in for certain existing sources like pneumatic controllers and others, where they recognize that there's going to be a significant amount of work to be done. Next slide, please. So let's talk about what does this rule cover, or it might be easier to talk about what the rule doesn't cover, frankly. So the rule covers kind of a whole host of sources that you would find at upstream facilities, as well as at compressor stations, natural gas processing plants, and when I say compressor stations, I think that means both compressor stations in the gathering and boosting segment, but also compressor stations in the transmission segment. And again, I think as Jay made clear, this is a GHG rule, a methane rule. So it's not limited to VOCs, although there are still a few places where VOCs are the sort of trigger pollutant for certain things. But in many cases, they have actually switched that to be methane. So what are the sources? Storage vessels and storage tank batteries. Fugitive emissions, both at well sites, at what they term centralized production batteries, at compressor stations and at gas plants. Pneumatic controllers, pumps, which historically has included pneumatic pumps, but is now going to include diaphragm pumps as well. Well unloading, pigging and blowdowns is one of the sources that they've not expressed exactly what they're going to do, as you'll hear later, but that's one of the sources that they're considering. Truck loadout, associated gas venting, essentially, either venting or potentially requiring flaring from separation equipment when you can't get into a gas sales line. Compressors, and control devices, the actual control devices that are used on the pumps, the storage tanks, the associated gas venting, and then a few other topics like sweetening units and abandoned wells. Next slide, please. So let's talk about storage vessels. What they're doing with storage vessels is pretty significant. And as many of you probably know, there is a lot of history around storage vessels under Quad O, and generally with EPA. There has long-standing been kind of, when EPA first did this, they did the Quad O and Quad OA on an individual storage vessel by storage vessel basis, as opposed to a battery. But the reality is that for most facilities, particularly new facilities, most of these tanks are in a battery. They're not typically single storage tanks. And so what that had done is create a lot of confusion, and their regulations are not very clear currently on how you calculate the emissions from a battery, from each storage vessel when they're part of a battery. And so there's been a lot of disagreement among EPA and industry about what is sort of standard practice for that. And in addition, storage tank batteries have undergone a series of enforcement cases kind of throughout the country. EPA, I think, has issued consent decrees with 10 to 12 different companies, some of them as recently as last month, on emissions from storage tank batteries. And typically that's emissions from, thief hatches and pressure relief valves that they believe should be making it to the control device. So what we've seen in sort of the conceptual information we were provided in this Quad OB is what I think is an attempt to address some of those concerns or outstanding issues with respect to storage tanks. So one of the biggest things is instead of it being an individual storage vessel under Quad OB, and again, that's effective now if their November 15th date holds. If you put in a storage tank or a storage tank battery after November 15th or 2021, you would ultimately be subject to their final rule if they are either vapor or liquid manifolded, or if the tanks are adjacent. And it appears that EPA is sort of trying to mirror what Colorado has done for a long time, over a decade, but they go a bit further than what Colorado has done. In Colorado, it really has to be liquid manifolded. So, your condensate tanks or your crude oil tanks and your produced water tanks are not considered part of the same storage tank battery. They can be vapor manifolded together and share a combustion device, but it doesn't mean they're necessarily the same storage tank battery. Here, EPA's definition, by saying either vapor or liquid manifolded, and they also use the term adjacent, meaning they describe it as if they're like on the same pad and located near each other. While I think that potentially moving to a battery model makes sense and will eliminate some of this ambiguity around individual storage vessels, I think they've gone a little too far, because I think it's going to be pretty complicated and not necessarily appropriate to combine different types of storage tank batteries like produced water and crude oil. The second thing they've done is they have they proposed a 6 ton per year battery VOC threshold, or a 20 ton per year methane threshold. And so instead of, historically it was always 6 tons per year for the individual vessel. So now this would bring in a whole lot of additional of storage tanks, because historically when you had a battery, and perhaps if you were averaging or taking an average of the tank emissions, you could have had potentially 10 tanks at 5 tons per year with a 50 ton per year total emissions, and still taking the position that you weren't subject to the Quad O or Quad OA, and here that would really eliminate that issue. I think one of the other really big changes that they claim as a clarification, although some of the language that they've submitted also makes clear that it may really be a change in the rules and not a clarification, is they've been much more clear about when they think a storage vessel or storage tank is modified for purposes of triggering Quad OB. And I think that's going to be really important, because there's a lot of, part of the reason EPA is making these changes is they have not gotten as many, I think, tanks that are subject to Quad O and Quad OA as they had expected. And so they've made this modification threshold much more conservative so that it's much easier to trigger. So they basically say that any single vessel or battery is modified when a physical or operational change is made to the storage vessel or tank battery that results in an increase in potential methane or VOC emissions. There's some real uncertainties there, in particular because we don't have rule language. For example, what do you compare the emissions increase against? Is that against when you first did your analysis about whether you were subject to Quad O or Quad OA or Quad OB? Is it against the day prior to the emissions increase? They have been clear that they think addition of storage vessels under this, an increase in storage capacity, or any vessel that receives additional oil, condensate, or produced water, like if you add a well, that those would all be modifications under this new proposal. And then perhaps, and pretty significant, is some of the language they have on storage vessels around legally and practically enforceable. This has been an issue that's coming up across the country in terms of, particularly with control devices, and what are the parameters and what are the types of things that you need in place to ensure that they're legally and practically enforceable. And they have had, and always historically have said, that if you have legally and practically enforceable controls on pursuant to a state regulation, then you can use the PTE, your PTE after your control, to evaluate whether you are subject to the NSPS. And that still holds here, but they are now proposing to make what is required for legal and practical enforceability pretty stringent. So they suggest that you have to have a quantitative production limit and a quantitative operational limit. They say you have to have an averaging time for production that's less than or equal to 30 days. You have to have parametric limits. You would have to have monitoring of those parametric limits, and you would have to have record keeping and reporting. And I think the key is, I'm not aware of a state, even though there's many states that have pretty stringent control requirements, that would actually likely have all of these parameters in place currently in order if EPA keeps this kind of legally and practically enforceable threshold. Next slide, please. So pneumatic controllers. So this is probably the one that many of you are the most concerned about, and it's probably the one that I think is probably one of the most concerning. Under the current requirements, it really has focused historically on whether you had high bleed pneumatic controllers and sort of phasing out of high bleed pneumatic controllers, but it allowed you to have intermittent pneumatic controllers or low bleed pneumatic controllers. This new proposal would eliminate essentially natural gas driven pneumatic controllers, except for certain exemptions in Alaska. So it's kind of an interesting proposal. So they would say that each pneumatic controller is an affected facility, and they would say that all new, modified, and reconstructed controllers have to have zero emissions. Zero emissions does include what they call self-contained, which means it goes back to process. That could be instrument air. It could be an electric or a mechanic controller. I think one of the things that's not entirely clear, because we don't have rule language, is whether self-contained includes the ability to route the natural gas pneumatic controller to a control device somehow. I would argue that it should, because that's certainly some of the technologies that are out there and available. And so what's interesting though is they want you to maintain documentation that you're not an affected facility. But if you comply with this rule, i.e. you have zero emissions, then you're not an affected facility, because the affected facility is only pneumatic controllers that emit natural gas. So it's kind of this really strange do loop, where if you are an affected facility, i.e. you meet natural gas, then you have to not have natural gas pneumatic controllers, which would then, I would argue, would make you not an affected facility. So it's kind of a very interesting quagmire, but it currently does not have, other than in Alaska, limitations for, do you have electric power? Are you going to have to put a generator out there and generate emissions associated with the generator to do this? We've faced the issue of pneumatic controllers in Colorado a number of times over the last 4 years. And industry and the agency and environmental groups and local governments had worked pretty closely together to come up with a pneumatic controller rule that was actually based on kind of total throughput through pneumatic controllers, and with the assumption that actuations are really what drive emissions for pneumatic controllers. And so that as long as you had certain percentage of your throughput was through non-emitting controllers, then you really met this. You met the requirements and you were reducing the emissions. This really addresses just each individual controller, and there's not a whole lot of outs. I think this is going to be one of the most contested pieces. I've heard a lot of concerns about vendor availability on this and how we would get to having, getting this information or getting all these done for all the people that would need them. And in particular, because they've also proposed the existing source guidelines to require zero emitting pneumatic controllers for existing sources. They expect that would phase in, but again, there's no specific time frame for that. Next slide, please. All right, this is my other one. This is my one, the fugitives. This one I actually think has some really concerning pieces. So this would apply for well sites if you had a baseline of methane emissions 3 tons per year or greater. And I think one of the most concerning pieces here is not the fact that you would have to do quarterly leak detection for those. It's that they want you to do a baseline emissions threshold. They want it, they say that it might include malfunctions, and they want, it's essentially, in my opinion, a site-specific methane inventory, because they basically mandate that to determine whether you need to comply with this rule, you would have to develop this baseline inventory. And then there's language in the proposal that says that if there is any increase, operational or physical increase or change that increases the emissions, you would have to redo the baseline emissions thresholds. And I think that is just a completely unworkable scenario. There should be no reason to redo your baseline emissions thresholds unless for some reason you were going to go over a more stringent requirement or under the requirement in the first place. They also have some concerning language about, you know, emissions from closed vent systems and how quickly they require repair. So as you probably know, in a leak detection program, you typically have a 30-day window to repair it, or maybe even longer if you need to go on delay of repair. This suggests that they're going to come out with language that says from a closed vent system, so like from a thief hatch or from a PRV, and I think that's because they think these could reflect concerns with design or overpressurization of tanks, that you have to repair it as soon as possible, and that any emission may be a violation of the no detectable emission standards that are currently in the Quad O and Quad OA rules, but have not historically been viewed in that manner. Another piece on this is, you know, control devices, which you'll hear me talk about a little more in a minute, are really getting extensive attention. And they've reflected in this rule that control device malfunctions, so your pilot light goes out, blown out by the wind, or other operational upsets are potential violations. They also have some concerning language about repairing and possibly doing a root cause analysis for all of these. You know, that has been a part of the storage tank consent decree requirements that I mentioned earlier, but not for every emission. And so I don't think it's appropriate to have to do a root cause type analysis every time you see a leak and you're able to repair it. You're going to hear a lot more from Dan on the Appendix K and the OGI protocol. Ultimately, I think I mentioned this, the frequency would be quarterly for well sites if you're over 3 tons per year of methane, or quarterly for any compressor station. There would be tiered repair deadlines based on the severity of the leaks, which also raises questions and concerns about whether you actually have to have, you know, a PID or some other quantitative metric that would allow you to determine what the actual severity of the leaks are. There are also a bunch of provisions regarding alternate screening technologies. So, you know, flyovers, use of drones, use of planes, and how you would be able to replace the like on the ground OGI inspections with those. Currently, they seemingly would make you do the screenings for the aerials more frequently, bi-monthly, with annual OGI in order to eliminate the quarterly OGI requirements. They have raised questions about the potential, and this has come up in Colorado and New Mexico and probably other states, about how third parties might identify emissions events. And obviously with all the technologies that are out there, that is a concern. And so, you know, one of the things to keep an eye out for is where EPA heads with what would they do with the information from third parties on emissions events that they find from their own flyovers. And then finally on the fugitives, they basically have an expanded fugitive emissions component definition. So they now include pneumatic controllers and control devices. And, you know, historically pneumatic controllers, they're designed to vent natural gas, and so they were not included in that. This sort of follows a program that Colorado has where they do require OGI on pneumatic controllers to determine if they're operating properly. Next slide, please. All right, well, liquids unloading. So one of the things that's a little unclear is language in the rule, in the proposal suggests that this is limited to gas wells. But again, because we don't have rule language, it's not 100% clear. It seems like it probably should be limited to gas wells because that's really where well liquids unloading occurs. but it ultimately requires liquids unloading with 0 methane or VOC emissions unless it's not technically feasible or safe. And in which case you would use BMPs if you could not do it because it's not technically feasible or safe. This is a pretty stringent requirement. You know, Colorado just adopted a well liquid unloading rule, I think the first in the nation, and it does not require 0 or methane or VOC emissions for all well liquids unloads. It has a threshold and is based on how many times a facility might unload, and allows for a whole host of other considerations. There's 2 ways they're thinking about this well liquid unloading. One is option 1, which is that the affected facility is defined as every well that undergoes liquids unloading, regardless of whether that liquid unload vents to the atmosphere. So here that would include plunger lifts, artificial lift. So something that is defined as well liquid unloading, even if it doesn't emit to atmosphere, then that facility would be an affected facility, and you would have to maintain the records of the number of unloads, even if it does not emit. That seems highly problematic to me, given that many of these artificial lift scenarios, they're designed, they don't event to atmosphere necessarily, and I don't know that everyone has a good track on how often those are operating or unloading. The second option is that the affected facility would be every well that undergoes unloading using a method that's not designed to totally eliminate venting. So if you have emissions from your affected facility, from your well during well unloading, then you would be subject to Quad OB. And you know, it's interesting because ultimately there really is no Quad OC for well unloading, because every well unload would be a modification, they basically suggested, so that you would always be triggering Quad OB if you did any unloading. Next slide, please. So a couple of others that I won't go into as much detail on, but reciprocating compressors. So there are existing requirements for reciprocating compressors for you to replace rod packing either every 26,000 hours of operation or 3 years, whichever occurs more frequently. They are considering another mechanism here for reciprocating compressors, which would be to monitor the rod packing emissions annually using some sort of flow measurement, and then replace the rod packing when you exceed 2 scuffs per minute. Or you could route to a process via a closed vent system under negative pressure. I understand that 2 SCF per minute could be particularly problematic. And another piece of this is that in any event, no matter where they land on reciprocating compressors, those had historically been excluded from production facilities, and now they will apply as proposed at centralized tank batteries. So if you have a centralized tank battery, even though it's in the production segment, reciprocating compressors at those facilities would either have to comply with this new requirement, or probably if they stick with the 3-year 26,000 hour requirement. Pumps, just wanted to note that it now, under this new proposal, would include natural gas driven piston pumps in addition to diaphragm pumps. Next slide, please. All right, a couple more. Associated gas flaring. So this is from the separator, and you know, they essentially say that they think the best system of emissions reductions is to route the associated gas to a sales line. They define the affected facility as any oil well that produces associated gas. So I think that means it's pretty much every oil well. And so they're saying you should route it to a sales line. And then if you can't, they require you to flare it. You are not allowed to vent it, and you would have to meet the flare requirements at 60.18 as part of that, and part of the proposal. 2 of the things that I mentioned earlier that they are looking at is for pigging and truck loadout. Those are ones that they did not have a real proposal conceptually thought out, that they are looking for information on. You know, Colorado regulates truck loadout, and also just adopted rules for pigging in the midstream sector. And New Mexico they're not totally released in writing yet, but they just adopted last month some pigging requirements there that includes more than just midstream, also upstream. And so they've thrown out there for pigging some of the things they're thinking about, whether it's controls, reducing the pigging frequency, eliminating the venting during it, or other liquids management techniques that would reduce the emissions from pigging. Next slide, please. All right, so control devices. One of the things that I'm not entirely sure, but they mentioned something about considering using control efficiencies at 98%. It's unclear because we don't have rule language how that would impact all of the existing facilities that currently use control devices that only have 95%, or states where they don't let you take more than 98% control, even if the manufacturer's design says it's more than 98. Sometimes they'll only let you take 95. So it's one to keep an eye out for when we see the rule language. And then this, again, as I said, this is getting to be a priority issue for EPA. They want potentially or considering additional flare performance measures, whether that's monitoring of flow, pilot flames, visible emissions, or continuous flame imaging systems. Colorado just developed a flare performance or combustor performance rule in December. And I think there's a lot of concerns and was a lot of discussion in that rulemaking on low flow for flow metering, when you can conduct performance tests, the methodologies for conducting performance tests. And so I think that this one's going to, again, be one to watch pretty closely. Next slide, please. So I think, there will be another opportunity to comment, as I mentioned, when the supplemental comes out at the end of the summer. And, just kind of keep an eye on the state's rules for existing sources. Many states already have existing rules and, pending, and they will also have to be looking at what the rules come out for Quad OC and how that dovetails with the existing requirements. And then timing, EPA is proposing a 2-year compliance timeframe following whenever the state submits their plan submittal, which again, we don't know entirely. I am now going to turn this over, I believe, to Dan, or maybe I'm turning this back to Jay. Jay, am I turning it back to you?
Yeah,
right.
I'll do a brief little intro to Dan here. But thank you, Jen. As you mentioned, we're holding questions until the end, but if anything Jennifer just talked about sparked some questions in your mind or anything like that, please be sure to go ahead and submit questions on the questions tab or the chat tab. We'll find them so that you'll see that on the attendee panel, and you can go ahead and just enter the questions and we'll be able to capture them at the end. And again, as Amy had mentioned earlier, if there's some topics you'd like to hear about in future webinars, please place them in the questions panel. So next up is Dan Wood. Dan's going to give you his perspective on Appendix K, and I think you'll find a lot of some pretty interesting things here if you really haven't paid attention to what this particular protocol is looking at. Dan's a air compliance specialist with Tri-Hydro. He's in our oil and gas air compliance team, and he knows more about optical gas imaging than I'll ever dream of. His experience includes project management and regulatory support for companies affected by federal, state, and local air environmental regulations. He specializes in rules related to OGI. His project experience includes OGI surveying using the infrared camera, natural gas compressor flow vent measurements, permitting assistance, emissions modeling, calculating oil and gas emissions, Method 21 monitoring, and consent decree compliance. And he's the air technical lead for Tri-Hydro's Leak Tracker Pro OGI fugitive emissions software data solution. So Dan, I'll go ahead and turn this over to you now.
Thank you, Jay. Well, thank you everybody again for joining us. And Jen did a really good job explaining Quad OB, Quad OC, getting into the weeds there. And ultimately at the same time we had this Appendix K proposal come out. And something that Jen alluded to was, we don't have reg text for Quad OB or Quad OC at this point, but we actually do for Appendix K. Appendix K was something out there that it came up, and kind of in passing, we really focused on, when we heard about Quad OC, we could be talking existing sources. That got a lot of the publicity and a lot of the attention. But ultimately, especially from the fugitive standpoint, Appendix K is something that we actually are going to have to be dealing with, and likely will be referenced in Quad OB and Quad OC. Now, what is Appendix K? Amy, next slide, please. Ultimately, Appendix K, it's a written protocol for OGI survey requirements. So, in the past, we've had Method 21, that gave us those requirements for using a TVA, using a sniffer, being able to detect leaks, but we haven't really had anything in the OGI world. The best thing that we had was when they released the alternative work practice, where it gave a little bit of information and a few details as to how we can operate the camera, details on instrument checks, but really didn't get into what do you need to do as a part of a survey. And so, ultimately, it's a good thing. It's going to allow us to complete these surveys consistently across the board. Doesn't matter what company or who you're working with or for. We're going to have consistency there, but ultimately you're going to see as we go through some of these slides that there's a lot of things out there that it's going to be challenging to implement. Ultimately we're probably going to see some changes and some updates as we get a final version of this. And something that's key to note is this is still just a proposed rule. But one takeaway, I mentioned the Quad OB and Quad OC, we'll see references there, but right now we're not seeing any references in any other rules. So for those rules like Quad OA, or for those facilities that are using the alternative work practice to comply with other LDAR rules at a gas plant or refinery, and right now there's no references there. So until we actually get reference to Appendix K within those rules, you still technically wouldn't need to follow Appendix K. Next slide, please. So for the first time ever, we have requirements for camera operator training. And a lot of rules out there, in the past, especially Quad OA, there were requirements within the rule to report basically information on training and experience. But technically, it could be zero. You could say zero training, zero experience, and that's okay. But at this point, you're going to be required to actually have full, robust training. And there's a couple concepts here that they refer to. One is senior OGI camera operator, and the other one is just an OGI operator. The senior OGI operator is going to be required to have a minimum of 500 surveys over the entirety of their career, with 20 of those in the past 12 months. So you can't just do surveys, have those 500 surveys, and then 5 years from now, you haven't done any surveys the last few years, still be considered a senior OGI operator. That person also needs to develop the classroom camera training. They say completed or developed. There's some ambiguity there. Is it just does that person have to attend a training? So we'll see what actually gets resolved with that. But with an OGI operator, we're talking about extremely robust training to get somebody going. And so right now you can essentially pick up a camera, give them some pointers. We have some training internally at Trihydro, but ultimately that person can still technically complete a survey. If you're last day of a regulatory compliance date, we can get that survey done, and we can get that person to a point that they actually are detecting leaks. But in this situation, before completing the classroom training and all of these OGI surveys, believe it or not, we're talking about 100. So 10 where the person's observing surveys, 40 side by side with a senior OGI operator, and then 50 independent surveys where it's directly supervised by a senior OGI operator. So you're talking about a total of 100 surveys that this person's going to be required to do before they can even independently conduct a survey. The other kind of requirement that I find really interesting is this concept of zero miss leaks based on a senior OGI operator following up. So if you do a survey, you have this final site survey test, and you even find one leak that the trainee didn't find, that person is going to have to kind of restart some of the and not necessarily the survey requirements, but some of the training itself. What I'd like to bring up here is this concept of site surveys. It's something that it's pretty ambiguous. We expect some changes. We're hoping that maybe this is going to turn into like an hourly requirement, because as you guys know, there's a fundamental difference between an upstream production well site survey versus a refinery survey or a gas plant survey. We're talking about very different durations, very different, what is that survey? What is the number of sites? And so it's something that's really ambiguous. There's been a lot of comments submitted in the docket for that. So that hopefully that's something that we're going to see some updates and some changes. The other thing, getting into this training refresher. So any camera operator that has not conducted a survey, in the last 12 months needs to be retrained. So this brings up a challenge in the world where, a lot of times you'll have your primary OGI surveyor completing surveys, or then you might have an operator or a maintenance person, or anybody out there, you happen to have a camera out where you can resurvey a leak. There's a left open leak from a survey. Well, if that person isn't trained according to these requirements, they're not going to be able to confirm that leak using the camera. So that's going to kind of fall back on, can you use soap bubbles? Can you use a TVA, via method 21? How do you do that if you don't have that training? Next slide, please. So for the first time that I've seen in terms of training, they're also going to require performance audits. So not only do you need to be trained, but they want to make sure that your performance, you're finding leaks, and that your performance is valid. And right now the requirement is going to be quarterly. So in a lot of cases, we're talking about doing performance audits at the exact same frequency as you're doing some of your surveys, on that quarterly scale. There's two possible methods permissible. One is comparative monitoring for 4 hours with a senior OGI operator, and the other is 4 hours of unedited, uncut video that you can send to an senior OGI operator, where they're going to go through that, make sure that first off you didn't miss any leaks, but also that you're following all of the steps and procedures to that you actually can be detecting leaks. And what's kind of a scary thing for a lot of us here is, if you miss a persistent leak, or fail to, that senior OGI operator thinks that maybe you didn't follow some sort of proper technique, well, now you have to go back and repeat a portion of that initial field training. And as you guys just saw, it's robust. There's a lot of training requirements there, and it's going to be a challenge for us to implement. Next slide, please. So getting out of kind of the requirements for the OGI operator, the person running the camera, before you even can start a survey, we're going to dig into these, the surveys themselves. What do you need to be doing as a part of the surveys? So there's a new concept called an established operating envelope. So basically what that is what are the possible conditions that you can actually conduct a survey and be effective, find leaks. And this is something that you have to set up in advance. It can't be something where you kind of stick your finger in the air and go, well, I think it's good today. We have to have quantitative data here. And one of those pieces is monitoring for changing conditions. So as weather changes over the course of the day, we all live out west here. We're in an area that we know that, an hour ago, weather could look a lot different than what it is now. that gets pretty problematic for us, because if you have an established operating envelope and now all of a sudden that changes, does this change your viewing distance? That's the easy fix. You just get a little bit closer to equipment to make sure that you're finding leaks. But there are a lot of other interferences that you could be dealing with, and they're listed here, wind, poor difference in temperature, steam, fog, mist, you name it. And then if any of these conditions are outside thresholds that you set limits on, you might have to actually delay your survey. It may not just be as simple as changing the maximum viewing distance. This is something that I know some of the OGI manufacturers, such as FLIR, they've actually posted some comments, because they actually think that in a lot of cases as a manufacturer, they could set some of these limits based on lab environments and set them for us. The other side of that is, when you're constantly monitoring for weather conditions, if you happen to go outside that by accident and you completed a survey, that survey is no longer valid. And from an OGI survey or manufacturer background, if you can't complete surveys with that device, it's kind of inhibiting the camera's best application. You're able to get out, get a lot of sites done, monitor a lot of equipment quickly. Next slide, please. So digging into the actual methodology of a survey, ultimately we're talking about really time-consuming and even video data-intensive things that you're going to be required to collect, but also just do. So a lot of us are used to doing daily verification checks. That's something that is required in even Quad OA. And for those of you familiar with Subpart W, it's another thing. You're required to do a daily instrument check in that case. Same thing, but in this case, they're requiring you to actually record a video of that. Another video you have to take is this quality assurance video, as it's called. It's got to be a minimum of 5 minutes, and it has to document all of the procedures the operator uses to survey. So getting into those dwell times, your viewing angles, distances, backgrounds, how you're dealing and getting good delta T, and what camera configuration you're using. So this is one of those things that is one of the most challenging things to implement. If you have to have a video that has all of those things, what about temperature, right? If you are constantly adjusting temperature, because that's a requirement of the camera, depending on the equipment, the ambient temperature, there are a lot of temperature changes that we experience when you're doing a camera survey. And so if you have to reflect every single one of those combinations, is that really realistic? And it's certainly not realistic in just a 5-minute video. And as you move through different process units or one process to another, there are a lot of things that you're going to be doing differently. So it makes you realize that this QA video could turn into a video of the entire facility, because you want to be able to capture all those things as required. One of the other requirements is, how are you going to conduct these monitoring surveys where you're ensuring all regulated components are monitored? They specifically call out in this situation the use of a component database alone not being a substitute to these next 3 approaches. So, hopefully we'll see where Appendix K can replace some of the requirements in, for example, the alternative work practice, where a lot of us are dealing with, you still have to do an annual Method 21 survey. That's what we're hearing. Hopefully all you would have to do in this situation is a OGI survey, but now those old component databases, those aren't good enough. So you can't use your LeakDOS or GuideWare database anymore alone to fulfill this requirement. One of the requirements that we saw in Quad OA was the use of a route map or map with designated observation locations. So basically you could just, on a plot plan or an aerial, draw what your actual walking path is. And right now, that appears to be probably the simplest solution. And in Quad OA, they also allow now a written narrative. And that's been a real challenge. You know, how do you develop a written narrative that says, I actually viewed everything. I can tell you exactly where I was. But here in Appendix K, they give 2 additional options. One is use of visual cues, so tags, streamers, color-coded pipes. Not sure that's really realistic. You know, if you wanted to paint all of your pipes in a facility, you know, go to a refinery and somehow paint pipes. You know, you could try and do that, but ultimately, you know, the changing conditions, it's just not something that's really going to be realistic in most situations. And then there's the most advanced technology. So using GPS route tracing. You know, I like this concept. You know, anytime that we can use modern technology, that's a good thing, I would argue. However, you know, there's some challenges there, such as, you know, getting into battery life concerns. You know, that is your device. You know, if you're constantly, you know, any of us that have used navigation, you know, driving somewhere, we realize that, you know, because that device is using your GPS, you know, it's using a lot of power. You know, is that going to be a challenge for you in that situation? But also, how accurate is it? You know, we've all been there where we've had a GPS point that doesn't exactly put us exactly where we're at on site. Or what happens when you walk into a building? Is your GPS accurate there? You know, in most cases, you know, the cameras, the GPS really isn't that good. So using that, trying to get a breadcrumb trail off of a camera, we've seen it using the FLIR cameras. It's just not quite there yet. You're not getting an exact path. I've seen that be almost a quarter mile off. I mean, that's getting outside of, you know, the permitting ranges that we deal with. And so, you know, if you don't have that accuracy set, and, you know, you're not able to really prove that you've, you know, viewed all of the regulated components and all of the equipment, that map that shows up, all of a sudden, you don't have proof anymore. And so that's a challenge that, you know, we're really going to have to assess. Is it something that, you know, is there going to be, you know, some flexibility there? You know, you know, are the regulators going to be able to, you know, look at that and go, yep, you were on site, you did your best, it's just that you had a GPS issue? Or is it, if you didn't get right next to this piece of equipment, it looks like you just completely skipped it? Another really interesting concept that, you know, none of us have really ever seen is addressing physical, mental and eye fatigue. Yeah, we all get tired. For those of us that have used, you know, HSM mode, for example, you know, or enhanced mode and on some of the OpGal cameras, you know, it's a little bit flashy, it's a little bit distorted, you know, probably, you know, give you a seizure if you look at it for too long. But, you know, you're always taking eye breaks during a survey. You know, when you just, standard practice from a safety perspective, you don't want to be looking through a camera while walking anyway. And so just by putting down the camera and walking to the next place or next angle that you're viewing the equipment at, you're really getting these, you know, these eye breaks in between. But the requirement is going to be 5-minute breaks every 20 minutes. So essentially, this is 25% of your available survey time in a day. You know, so 2 hours in an 8-hour day, roughly. You know, that's something that, you know, some of that time, yeah, you could fit in lunch, you could fit in, you know, other breaks or other things, but, you know, this is something that we're going to have to be able to track. You can't just say, you know, yes, we kind of did it. We don't know exactly when. We're going to have to track this information to prove that this is something that we actually did. The alternative here is using 2 OGI operators. So if you have 2 guys available, they can do continuous surveying because they're kind of alternating time on and off the camera. Now, the reality is, you know, if we're in a refinery or a gas plant or just a larger facility in general, that might be an effective solution and even still pretty cost effective. But if you're going out to a well site, does it really make sense to have 2 trained operators out on site to be able to go through and really quickly go through a survey? Probably not. It's just not going to be cost effective. There's too much time between surveys. It's just going to be a waste. We'll have to see exactly where that goes. Are they going to retain that requirement since it's not something that we've ever seen historically? We'll have to see once we get a final rule. Next slide, please. One of the additional requirements, and it's been discussed in the OGI world for a really long time, is we're talking dwell time. So how long do you need to spend on a component to effectively survey it, let alone how many components? You could look at it the other way. How many components in, let's say, an hour can you do? You know, when we're from a method 21 side, you know, we have expectations of a person, how many components you can monitor in an hour, but we've never really had that with OGI. One of the using an OGI camera, the benefits there are you can look at a lot of components at one time. So for example, if you're looking at a bunch of components that are, you know, small little 1/4-inch tubing, and you could have 1,000 components technically in one image because you're looking at a lot of tubing, a lot of compression fittings in one little small area. Where on the flip side, if you're looking at a 36-inch valve, you might get one valve, one component in an image. What they are going to require is 5 seconds per component with at least 2 angles. So basically every component's, we're talking about 10 seconds. Is that something that's really realistic from an OGI camera standpoint? Not really. You know, we're already just trying to find emissions. Are we going to be expected to do component counts at the same time and make sure that we're facilitating this? They do allow this complex scene chart. So on the right side of the slide, you can see a monitoring area and number of components. And so essentially, you know, if you have a complex scene, they say, well, you can actually look at more components than just one every 10 seconds. But ultimately, you know, are we going to stand there and we're going to count every single one of these components? That's going to be really challenging. We already know how long a standard component count at a facility can take, but doing that while doing an OGI survey, it's going to be a real challenge, and we're not sure if this is something that's actually going to be implemented based on some discussions with EPA. Next slide, please. So I put a lot of stuff on this slide, and I did it on purpose. There is a lot of record keeping associated with this. You know, we're kind of used to it on the LDAR side, and as we got Quad OA, we realized there was a lot of information that we have to collect. But now we've got more, and there's a lot more in terms of video, really data intensive record keeping requirements as well. Going from your equipment records, so all of the information on your maintenance, documentation, daily verification checks, getting into that 5-minute plus video, your survey information, so kind of general info on your, you know, let's say met data, start end times, all of that, leak data, so pictures of leaks, all of the information associated with component type, subtype, you know, GPS coordinates, all of that. What your operator training and audit records look like. A lot of that stuff, you know, a lot of us have a certificate, but have we been tracking all of these hours and other things associated with it? Maybe not. But ultimately, you know, we're going to need, you know, some good solutions there. You know, in my case, you know, and Jay had mentioned I'm the subject matter expert on our leak tracker team. You know, that was something that we developed so that we can actually comply and collect all of this information. But ultimately, we're going to need something. We can't use Excel or Access or, you know, some of the, even paper anymore to comply. And ultimately, if you don't document it, it just didn't happen. So having these records available and readily available in the event of an audit, that's going to be key. Next slide, please. So that's really the core of Appendix K. You know, the main requirements. You know, we could get into the weeds even more than that. But what do you do right now? Is there anything that you actually can do to try and, you know, maybe prepare yourself for a final rule? So there's a few things you can do. You're going to want to track every OGI technician's field training and time conducting monitoring events. I would recommend doing hours, you know, but hours and surveys, that's a good thing to collect. Check your current OGI equipment. Is it compliant? Is it something that you're going to have to send in for calibration? Is it even a technology that can meet the requirements within Appendix K in terms of sensitivity? Have a system in place to track all of your OGI camera maintenance records and just general data management and training. If right now you're using Excel, there are a lot of solutions out there that you can use that really can collect all of this information and store it in one place and have it readily available. Make sure you're assessing those things. And lastly, assess your training level of personnel right now. Do you have a senior OGI operator? If the answer to that is no, that could be a real challenge. You don't have anybody that can conduct training, do performance audits, do anything associated with at a higher level beyond an OGI camera operator. So that's something, is it something that you could get somebody to that level before this goes final and hopefully be able to grandfather that person in? All things to be considered. Next slide. So I'm just going to touch on a few things. Something that we're moving away from Appendix K. We're dealing with a lot of ESG related items now. ESG, it's the big word, it's the flashy word. Everybody's talking about it. We know we have the SEC rule for those of you that are working for a publicly traded company. That you're going to be dealing with. But ultimately, the takeaway here is ESG by itself. It's not a replacement for being compliant. The governance piece of that really is complying with regulation. And something that I always like to talk about is, sometimes you can do these ESG or voluntary type programs at very minimal cost. Sometimes you can balance operational excellence with enhanced environmental performance. So if you can show quantitatively that you're not emitting as much, but at the same time maybe keep something in your pipes more, or operationally be more efficient. Sometimes it can be even in terms of combustion, on your engines. If you're able to make something more efficient and, from a combustion side, use less fuel, that's also a good thing, and it's going to save you money. Something that we're dealing with a lot is this concept of RSG, responsibly sourced gas, sustainable green gas. ESG, and a lot of these voluntary programs tend to be shareholder or investor driven. They, as we start dealing with even some of the export companies, sending gas, for example, to Europe, especially in today's world, realizing that their expectation is that you've got sustainably sourced gas. So if you can do things now to start showing that the way that you're producing, transporting your gas is responsible and so-called green, that's going to give you a lot of leverage later in terms of proving that, and if maybe some of your dollars are actually tied up in that way. So one of the things that we see a lot of folks moving to are voluntary OGI programs as a way to kind of start. A lot of facilities, you're required by regulation to complete OGI surveys. In this case, we're really, there's a lot of things that you can do that with an OGI camera, pre-acquisition risk assessment, getting into health and safety reasons, general major findings, large leaks, subsurface leaks, but just leaks outside of regulatory driven work. So like a fuel gas system at a gas plant, for example, may not be in an LDAR program. You can look at that using your camera, and you're also going to keep that gas in your pipes. One of the things that comes up a lot now, where we tend to have a lot of folks that are able to just get a camera, come out, take a look at a facility, and they don't know what they're looking at. Well, ultimately, we would expect those folks to also have to comply with Appendix K and the requirements in Appendix K. But if they're looking at your facility and you might have a third-party equipment at your facility, historically, you go up with a sniffer maybe, but it might be behind a fence. Well, if they're going to see third-party equipment at your facility, it's going to be expected that it's yours. And so you can use the camera to just glance at it, make sure that there's nothing leaking. And if there is, you can contact that company and have them go ahead and assess that. Next slide, please. So the thing that I'm going to end on is new technology. We tend to always want new technology. It's a good thing. In a lot of cases, it makes us more efficient and really enhances our ability to detect leaks and do our jobs. You know, there are always strengths and weaknesses of every technology out there. So here we're talking about OGI in a lot of cases, but there's a lot of continuous and drone, sky-based, satellite imagery, you name it out there. The idea, the message that I'd like to send to everybody is sometimes one technology isn't the best, but another one is a little bit better, but in a lot of cases, they can be complementary to each other. So something that you can do as an example is have a continuous type sensor that would alarm somebody to go boots on the ground with OGI technology, or be able to quantify a little bit better on site, find exactly what the leak source is. But using multiple technologies sometimes is the right method. But don't purchase a technology or buy off into a technology until you've figured out what you need. Is it regulatory driven? Is it even allowed from a regulatory side? What's the data? Is it public data? Is there information using one technology to another that you don't want out there? Just assess all of those things and make sure that the technology that you're investing in and putting your money into actually is going to be effective for your facility, and not just trying to get a technology out there and just kind of make it work for your facility. But ultimately, that's what I have, and I'll bring it back over to Jay.
Thanks, Dan. I guess if anybody hasn't been thinking a lot about Appendix K so far, hopefully this gives people a lot of ideas about saying, ooh, this might be a big deal and I better react to it. So now we're going to shift into questions and answers from the panel. So thanks everybody for paying attention. We've got a few questions already that we can put in front of people, but I again want to encourage people to, even as we're wrapping up the day today, to go ahead and put some questions out there that we can get our experts to be able to respond to. So I'll throw out a couple of them right now that are sitting in front of us. First one I got here, and I'll probably be paraphrasing some of these, but Dan, how much longer would an OGI survey take with the new Appendix K requirements as opposed to what is kind of the norm right now?
So right now, ultimately, since we're going to be dealing with all of the dwell time and additional, requirements just for collecting data, we're estimating somewhere in the 3 to 4 times range. Now, it's going to vary a lot by facility, but that's kind of the expectation now.
So 3 to 4 times as long to do the equivalent inspection of what might be going on today in normal.
Exactly.
Okay. And that translates into dollars ultimately for a lot of the operators.
Exactly. Yeah, big time dollars. Because when anytime that, and sometimes it could be, especially on the production side, when you're only able to get, a third of the number of facilities in the same day, sometimes you're mobilizing into an area from quite a distance. So it really can get expensive quick.
Okay, great. Jen, somebody asked this at a broad level, but they were I think the primary focus was on the fact that the proposal dates are the proposal date, like in this case for the rule, which doesn't even have rule language yet, is the effective date on the rule. And I know that this is kind of common for NSPS rules. It actually happened in Quad O and Quad OA, and happens for a lot of other ones. But I think the main question was, why does EPA use that date?
Yeah, I mean, so I think they typically are allowed under the NSPS to use the date from the date they propose the rules. And I think part of the reason is because they put people on notice that if you build a facility, you should be anticipating what's going to be happening. It doesn't mean that the rules are effective as of that date, because the rules may change. And so it's always been a little bit of a strange thing, because you know, operators are left trying to guess what is going to happen. But I think ultimately what EPA wants to do is give enough notice that, like, hey, there's these facilities that are going to be considered new or modified by the rule. And, you know, I think it also eliminates, from their perspective, people going and making changes before the new rule becomes final, right? Because otherwise that might happen, and then they'd lose some of that. And, you know, I think I alluded to it, but there is still, I think, going to be some dialogue and some question on the legitimacy of the November 15th date here, because of the fact that there was no rule language, and it makes it quite difficult for people to even understand what they might possibly have to do, even if that is a trigger date. So.
Okay, great, thank you. I think this one will go to Dan. So someone was asking if they have currently been doing their own OGI surveys in-house using their own staff and people. This would be like an operator, I assume. Does that mean that they would have to have at least one senior OGI operator on staff, you know, and employed by that company, or are there other ways to work through that kind of audit or QA process? Sure,
good question. So basically, you know, the short answer to that is you don't have to. It probably would be the easiest in that situation, to have somebody there always readily available. But there's certainly, you know, folks even, you know, like for hydro here, you know, we've got several OGI senior OGI operators, but there's always going to be somebody out there that can help you, and you certainly would be able to contract that out to. Now, you know, one thing to keep in mind is with the requirements there, you know, you're talking about, you know, right now, quarterly performance audits. There's a lot there that you would be required to contract out. There's a lot of time. So, you know, over time, it could become a pretty costly thing to do. But there's certainly resources available for those people to, you know, at least, you know, fill an interim, even if it's just an interim situation where you don't have that senior OGI operator, that, you know, somebody would be able to help.
Okay. Okay. I think that'll be helpful for people in their planning, at least. Jen, one of the questions was for some of the changes that are proposed in there, like for pneumatic controllers and things. Are there still some of the same language as existed in the past, where if you need to have natural gas for a safety reason or something like that, can you still justify those, or is it a blanket requirement that you have to go to non-emitting controllers?
Yeah, currently, as they've written up the you know, we don't have language again, but the draft concept, they do not have an out for safety, right? Which is kind of interesting, because some of the programs they've been looking at, like Colorado, do have exemptions for safety and process. But they have made clear they don't think they need to retain that. I think that's going to be really interesting on how that plays out with the ability to use, you know, because really, unless you are able to use the self-contained routing to a process, you know, I know, for example, there's technology out there that will route the pneumatics back to, like, the heater treater pilot. I would consider that routing to process, although technically it might be to combustion. But, you know, there might be then limitations on what all you can route to that heater treater pilot. And so I think that, you know, unless they ultimately take the position the only thing you can use is instrument air, I suspect they will need to include some safety exemptions and process exemptions, hopefully in the final.
Okay. Okay, thanks. So another question probably is a little bit directed at me because I brought it up, but Jen, you might, I'll try answering this one first, but feel free to jump on it as well. Someone asked if the House and the Senate flip, might there be an opportunity that the Congressional Review Act, like it did earlier for Quad OA, might come into play to eliminate these set of changes that we're talking about right now when they go final? And I'll start my first answer on that. And if Jen, if you have any other thoughts, please add on. But I'd end up saying probably not, because more than likely the president wouldn't sign off, at least on the congressional review resolutions. I don't know if there's a formal veto, but I think it wouldn't be signed. That's why you typically see these Congressional Review Act issues come up when there's been a wholesale change of the House, Senate, and the president from one party to another party. And the other part that drives into the Congressional Review Act is there's a technical detail on timing that limits the Congressional Review Act to things that rules that were finalized in the last, I believe it's 60 congressional days, which is not a calendar day thing at all. So it's relatively recent actions as well. And that makes it complex as well. Okay. So yeah, I think the bottom line on that is don't look for that to happen, right? That would be what basically I think where we're all going with that one. Dan, this is more of a statement, I think, than it was a question, but the question or whatever it is I thought EPA wanted to encourage the use of optical gas imaging as a cost-effective change from Method 21, but it seems with what you just described that maybe that's not the case.
Yeah, good statement. Certainly not the case in the proposed rule right now. I would hope that we get some clarification, because we do know the EPA, they want the new technology. They reference, OGI as the best system of emission reductions in a lot of cases. And, if they inhibit our ability and inhibit the benefits that OGI, gives us, ultimately, nobody's going to use it as an alternative. For example, some of us will be required to use it anyway, based on, for example, Quad O, B, or C. But, in some of these Method 21 programs that they would prefer us likely to switch over to an OGI camera for, it's probably not going to happen. So really good observation. And, ultimately, if we're talking a lot more time, a lot more cost, we're not going to switch. We're just not going to see that transition.
Okay. I've got one other one here, Dan, that I think you might be able to respond to quickly. I think this is probably the last question we have time for right now. So how do you get weather data and things like that, wind speeds and stuff on sites, especially, a lot of these sites are remote. There's no weather service location nearby or anything like that.
Good, really good question. So, our standard work process is to carry a portable anemometer that it also it collects your wind speed, your temperatures, gives you maximum averages, different things like that. That started with Quad O, because the reality is, you could be 50, 100 miles from the nearest, especially National Weather Service Met station. And so since there's conditions can be so much different, or even one, the National Weather Service station might inhibit your ability to do the survey, but the conditions on site are good enough for you to do the survey. We can collect that data that way.
Okay, great. I think that's all we got time for. Amy, were you going to come on now and kind of close this out?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jay. We're reaching obviously the end of our time. What a great presentation from all of our speakers. And Jay, thanks for moderating. Please be sure to fill out our exit survey and help us target and tailor these webinars better for you in the future. There's an opportunity in the survey to request some one-on-one time with our subject matter expertise that you can discuss your interests further. Also, a link to the recording of today's webinar will be sent to you via email and will be available on Tri-Hydro's website after the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to Montana Petroleum Association for the opportunity to present today. And again, thank you to all of our speakers. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.